Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Nabertel, and I am a political science professor. I selected the book Man's Search for Meaning by Victor Frankl, who happened to be in Nazi concentration camps for 3 years and unfortunately was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. Frankl wrote this book in 1945 in about 9 days. He shares his horrific observations that he witnessed in the concentration camps, yet this book is not intended to be a comprehensive rundown of all the horrific details of life in a concentration camp. Instead, as a psychologist and philosopher, he uses these worst possible experiences and observations to grapple with existential questions. If you were to read just one page, I'd highly recommend page 75. And on that page, Frankl states, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." The latter part of the book discusses and covers Frankl's theory of logotherapy, which is a form of therapy he originated in practice. Logos is the Greek word for meaning. And so this is a form of therapy that's based upon finding meaning for the patient. Now, despite this book only being about 150 pages, as you might expect, it's not easy reading due to the graphic content and also grappling with philosophical questions like the meaning of life. I selected this book for several reasons. First, when I first read this book about 25 years ago, I had switched my major to psychology. I remember picking this book up off the shelf at Borders. It had a profound impact on me when I first read it, and I also gave this book to several friends and family members. Secondly, as the Greek philosopher Heraclitus quote about how you don't step into the same river twice, as the river is not the same or the person stepping into it. I haven't reread this book in its entirety until the last few days. It was invigorating to reread a book that had such a profound impact on me in a completely different stage of my life, and to see how it holds up today. As I read this book this time, it inspired so many thoughts and questions that I don't recall having 25 years ago. I really enjoyed applying it to the discipline I teach, which is political science. I thought that there was many connections to the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been living through in the past year. And I also think there's a lot of other contemporary issues in society that are relevant to some of the principles of this book. And lastly, despite this book being 75 years old, I think it's still extremely timely and relevant for people to read. According to the U.S. Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey conducted in 2018, over half the respondents didn't know how many people were murdered in the Holocaust or could even name a single concentration camp. Anti-Semitic incidents in the United States hit a 4-decade high in 2019, according to the Anti-Defamation League. And one of the people who was inside the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021, had a shirt or a sweatshirt that said Camp Auschwitz on it. So this book is still very important and timely to read. I wanted to talk about a few key themes that really resonated with me. There's potential spoiler alerts in here, so feel free to stop listening or watching the video at this time. But Frankl thinks that meaning can be achieved through 3 main domains. The first, love. The second, creating a work or doing a deed, contributing to society. I think those are probably not surprising to most people. I think what's unique about Frankl's contributions is it's this third domain, which is the attitude and meaning that we can take through suffering. He was ahead of his time. I think there's countless modern psychologists and self-help gurus who have focused on grit, perseverance, struggling, being future-oriented. I remember reading recently some people like psychologist Angela Duckworth and her amazing book, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. So these traits are mentioned, directly or indirectly throughout his book. So he really was ahead of his time. As just one example on page 81, he says, we could say that most men in a concentration camp believe that the real opportunities of life had passed. Yet in reality, there was an opportunity and a challenge. One could make a victory of those experiences, turning life into an inner triumph, or one could ignore the challenge and simply vegetate, as did a majority of the prisoners. And that's on page 81. Considering the awful crimes against humanity that Frankl witnessed and experienced, it was interesting to read his perspective on human nature and the evil that humans are capable of. On page 93, he states, it is apparent that the mere knowledge that a man was either a camp guard or a prisoner tells us almost nothing. Human kindness can be found in all groups, even those which as a whole it would be easy to condemn. The boundaries between groups overlapped, and we must not try to simplify matters by saying that these men were angels and those were devils. Now, I just think that has a lot of resonance today. We can't generalize groups, professions, demographics. As he says, there's either decent or non-decent people. I also think that Frankl, as I mentioned earlier, was ahead of his time. I think that he was a pioneer in influencing many psychology fields that emerged from his work. In reading this book, one can see the foundations of popular concepts such as flow, the psychology of happiness, transcendence, and how to live a meaningful life. He viewed success and happiness as something that can't be just pursued, but only attained as an unintended side effect of personal dedication to a cause greater to oneself, or as a byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. I wanted to share some new perspectives that I have reading this in March of 2021 that I don't recall having 25 years ago. And this is in no way intended to be a critique of the book, but more about how my interpretation of the book has evolved. So one of the first things that came to my mind when reading this book now is thinking about, can we extrapolate based on the experiences of those in the Holocaust and the exceptional people like Frankl? To be specific, on page 76, he states, it is true that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained those values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. This is incredibly moving to know what humans are capable, but it makes me think, as a political scientist, I wouldn't want to make policy based on these exceptional superhumans who are outliers, people like Frankl. Instead, we would want to use data on what the vast majority of humans would do in typical circumstances. My concern is that this level of analysis perhaps misses the forest from the trees in understanding the massive scale of human depravity in which 6 million people were killed. Although this is not part of the task of the Moraine Reads program, I would like to take an opportunity to apply this book to American political ideologies. It wasn't my intention to do this when I reread the book, but as I read the book again, I couldn't help but think about how his writing relates to political ideology. To be clear, Frankl doesn't explicitly reference political ideologies, what governments should or shouldn't do, conservatism or liberalism. Yet I found it interesting to consider his writing through the framework of political ideologies and the contemporary challenges that we face. So Frankl prioritizes the importance of meaning in life. In light of this, should the government do anything to promote the ability of people to achieve meaning? He cites Nietzsche's words, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." So what I would like to think about is there anything that the government could do to help people have their own why? Or is this strictly in the hands of the individual person? In applying American conservatism, which I would likely place Frankl's view, I think the answer to that question is no. This can only be done by an individual through one's own mindset and having their own unique why to live through life's hows. I think conservatism focuses on self-reliance, rugged individualism, and many religious conservative principles of meaning through suffering and belief in salvation that Frankl spoke of. For example, on page 85, he says, life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill its tasks which constantly sets for each individual. He specifically states that he doesn't believe that we are a pawn or victim of outer influences or inner circumstances. You know, Frankl studied people experiencing unemployment who had depression. On page 142, he states, consequently, whenever I succeeded in persuading the patients to volunteer in youth organizations, adult education, public libraries, and the like, in other words, as soon as they could fill their abundant free time with some sort of unpaid but meaningful activity, their depression disappeared. Although their economic situation had not changed, their hunger was still the same. The truth is, man does not live by welfare alone. I think you could take that quote, and many modern conservative thinkers have, essentially said those same types of things, that, people don't want handouts, that people want meaning, that, it's important for people to kind of find their own path and to make it on their own. I would place Frankl on that conservative side of personal responsibility. He brought up this interesting idea that he said that he believed in personal responsibility, and that he recommended that the United States have a statue of responsibility on the West Coast of the United States to balance out the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. On page 75, he says, every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become a plaything of circumstance, renouncing the freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of a typical inmate. As I said earlier, I think this is consistent with a core conservative principle that personal responsibility is the prime factor in what determines one's fate. Whereas liberals, at least American liberals, are more likely to highlight societal and systemic factors that lead to suffering, such as racism, sexism, hate crimes, homophobia, discrimination against those who don't identify as straight, white males who aren't disabled. When I think of American liberalism, I generally think of a more active and bigger government, an optimism that government can help solve major problems. I think those who advocate for a more involved or stronger government might question why governments around the world, particularly in Europe and the United States, didn't do more to stop the rise of fascism, Nazism, or allow more Jewish refugees from Europe, or liberate concentration camps sooner, or intervene in more modern examples of genocide. In short, liberals are typically more supportive of government intervention to protect against human rights abuses throughout the world. I also think liberalism would be supportive of providing opportunities for people to achieve meaning. Apathy, powerlessness, and lack of meaning will likely manifest itself in many troubling ways, perhaps like the recent rise in suicides, alcohol and drug addiction, and declines in mental health, or politically, more recently, through the rise of extremism, conflict, and belief in conspiracy theories. Personally, I worry about millennials and Generation Z being able to realize the three core paths to meaning that Frankl identified, particularly coming through, as the younger people come through age, through the Great Recession, and more recently, through a pandemic. I would like to revisit Frankl's core paths to meaning and consider them through the lens of people who are younger than me in my age cohort. And I'm 44, full disclosure. So people who are younger than I am. So first, he says love, that we can achieve meaning through love. Statistically, fewer millennials are living with a spouse and their own child compared to any previous generation at a similar age, according to a 2020 Pew Research survey. 2019 had the lowest birth rate in 32 years, according to the CDC, and this was pre-pandemic. And then the second main way that we can achieve meaning is through work. Millennials and Generation Z have higher levels of unemployment and lower incomes, according to that same 2020 Pew Research survey. On page 79, Frankl talks about unemployed worker that has a provisional existence and struggles to live for the future. That makes me think of the many gig workers, part-time workers, and unemployed who have struggled to make ends meet. The lack of health insurance, retirement benefits, paid time off from work, lack of employment stability, or the certainty of knowing what their schedule is going to be. And then the third way that Frankl identifies that we can get meaning is through suffering, a spiritual freedom, or essentially a faith. It's not explicitly mentioned, but I think it's part of this third domain. And in terms of faith, religious faith, it's important to remember that for 18 to 29-year-olds today, compared to their older peer groups, fewer identify with a religion. In fact, 44%, according to American Family Survey in 2019, don't identify with a religion amongst those who are 18 to 29. So if you visualize this as a three-legged stool with love, work, and suffering / spiritual faith as the three legs to the stool, I worry that that meaning through suffering is the most viable path that some young people have. The concern for the youth isn't new. In fact, 75 years ago on page 143, Frankl says, just consider the mass neurotic syndrome so pervasive in the young generation. There is ample empirical evidence that the three facets of this syndrome, depression, aggression, and addiction, are due to what is called in logotherapy as the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaningless. As unfortunately statistics have shown, death rates from drug overdoses for those ages 15 to 24 rose by nearly 20% from 2006 to 2015, according to a study in the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs. In light of these trends, a liberal may ask, should governments do more to intervene to provide better opportunities for those who have been left behind in this modern, globalized, technology and information-led economy? Should there be government-led initiatives to help people, particularly those who are younger, be able to have or achieve the American dream, such as going to college, getting married, having a family, owning a house? Lastly, I wanted to talk about reading this book after living through a year of a pandemic. Elicited a lot of connections for me. On page 79, Frankl talks about the uncertainty of a time frame of suffering, not knowing when there's going to be a deadline to your suffering. He states specifically, prisoners too suffered from this time experience. In camp, a small unit of time, a day for example, filled with hourly tortures and fatigue, appeared endless. A larger unit of time, perhaps a week, seemed to pass very quickly. My comrades agreed when I said that a day in camp lasted longer than a week. How paradoxical was our time experience? Now, I in no way, shape, or form want to try to compare experiences of the Holocaust to the COVID-19 pandemic. But that being said, I do think many people could identify with that time experience that he's referring to, where the days are long, but when you look back, the weeks or months seem like they went by fairly quickly. As of March 15th, 2021, the United States has passed over 534,000 deaths, and so much of our lives have been completely upended and filled with anxiety and uncertainty. This book helps me grapple with what meaning we might be able to gain from our suffering that we've experienced this past year. And much of what makes this book so thought-provoking is its focus on existentialism, the philosophical examination of what human existence means, what the meaning of life is. On page 111, he says, the existential vacuum, or not having meaning, manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom. I can't help but think of all the binge watching, social media consumption, entertainment, sports watching, etc. According to a 2019 report by Common Sense Media, it found that not including schoolwork, the average teenager has 7 hours of screen time per day. This is just one example of why I find Frankl's focus on the importance of meaning extremely relevant 75 years after he wrote this book. I would still recommend this book, Man's Search for Meaning, because I think it deals with many deep questions that will spark invigorating questions. It was really interesting for me to reread this book and see how my interpretations and views have evolved. I realize my relationship to this book is not the same as it was in an earlier phase of my life. But that's one of the beautiful things about being able to reread books. Thank you for allowing me to participate and watching my video. It's been really interesting to watch other videos as part of this Moraine Reads series and read and see all the diverse selections that people have. I highly recommend that you too take on this project and share a book that you have found very interesting, something that inspired you, and share it with others. Thank you.